So once upon a time there was a company called Capcom who made a game called Street Fighter. And it sucked. Fortunately, a few years later they made Street Fighter 2 and it ruled the world. Okay, let's just skip to the relevant bits. So one day Capcom begat Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, which is basically Street Fighter in puzzle form. The game eventually got a conversion over to the PlayStation 1, which I'd imagine is how most people would have first played it back then. But years later, it would be released onto the Game Boy Advance courtesy of developers Atomic Planet, the same folks responsible for the Mega Man Anniversary Collection that graced the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. So we've got some talented people behind the wheel here, and really, is it any surprise that there would be some semblance of Puzzle Fighter on GBA, the successor to Game Boy, the thing that brought you Tetris, that thing they made a movie about? Chances are, if there was a puzzle game back in the day, it was on Game Boy. Whether it was Classic, Color, Advance, or whatever, doesn't matter. If it's a puzzle game, it's probably on Game Boy. And if it isn't on there, you're probably not looking hard enough. Case in point. So Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, there is no other Puzzle Fighter aside from that unless you want to count the short-lived mobile version that came out a few years ago and everybody forgot about. But anyway, you have a cast of 8 playable characters to choose from, a combination of Street Fighter mainstays and a couple Darkstalker characters for good measure because we're not doing anything else with these guys, I guess. And the premise is simple, at least on paper. You have gems falling from the sky in a variety of colors, and your main goal is to clear these gems from the board by touching them with crashed gems of the same color, which upon contact will shatter the gems and make up more space for you to fill with other stuff. If you group a bunch of same colored gems together in squares or rectangular masses, they'll combine to become giant power gems, which are more cumbersome to navigate around, but are worth more, especially in combo clears. See, Puzzle Fighter is head-to-head competitive puzzle fighting, so the idea is to clear enough gems to send counter gems at your opponent. Counter gems are sort of timed gems that take up space, but after a number of gem drops become normal gems. Each character has a pattern of counter gems to toss against their opponent, and the more counter gems sent the other way, the more difficult it becomes to overcome. And while this is going on, you have a little fight going on with the mini Street Fighter Darkstalker people that's there in the middle for show, but the more impressive plays you pull off, the more exciting moves you'll execute. Hell, a great finish will even result in a super combo finish. Once a player tops out, they lose, obviously, and stuff. Puzzle Fighter boasts a number of game modes. Aside from the usual arcade mode, you also have Street Battle, a variety of character-specific special challenges that net you different rewards if you complete said challenges, such as alternate character colors or secret codes to play as hidden characters. Versus mode is a 2-player versus local multiplayer mode. This is achieved by having one player use the D-pad on the Game Boy to move their gems on their side, and the other player using the A and B buttons to move their gems around, and already, the whole thing feels like a gigantic clusterfuck. Fortunately, there's a proper link mode that you could play with another player via Game Link, and ignore this other versus mode even exists or something, because why? Why? Admittedly, Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo is not my kind of puzzle game. The kind that is more in line with head-to-head competitive fare that demands a little more than a more casual marathon-based puzzler would. As a 2-player game, it's fine, but in particular against a computer opponent who always seems to be several steps ahead of the player, it's the sort of style that if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be overwhelmed, and even then, sometimes, it's a matter of luck just to get to a point where you're being merely whelmed, and you're waiting for one of those diamonds that clears all gems of the same color or type that it touches to clean things up a bit. Needless to say, this is the sort of thing that would excel greatly as a 2-player game, because as a single-player game, even on the easiest settings, nah, not for me. Now with that said though, Puzzle Fighter ain't too shabby of a game. The premise takes a while to wrap your head around, the gameplay feels a bit clunky at first, lacking the somewhat fluid control of a good Tetris or even Puzzle League game, and sometimes has you relying on strokes of luck rather than skilled play in order to claim a win. But once you figure out how things work and get a feel for the whole deal, there's a bit of fun to be had there. Eventually you can get good enough to tackle the Street Battle challenges and unlock some additional colors and stuff, and should you have your Game Link and a second copy of the game, multiplayer is always a fun time, but not this shared GBA Game Boy, one side uses one. That's a bit stupid. Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo adopts a chipified visual style based on that of the Street Fighter Alpha and Darkstalkers games, that general era of CPS2-based fighting game. The centerpiece of the playfield, aside from the main play areas obviously, is the little fight taking place between the two characters. This apparently proved popular enough to spawn a proper fighting game spin-off thing, Super Gem Fighter aka Pocket Fighter, and hey, we need something to justify the Street Fighter-y theme to this puzzle game beyond a generic backdrop with a handful of sound effects. The main playfield is laid out nicely, gems look fine, shattering effect feels somewhat slow and clunky, but that adds to the drama I suppose. The little intermissions that you have every few rounds are fun little bits of sprite animation. It's a pleasant enough looking game. In keeping with the general theme, Puzzle Fighter sports largely cutified versions of pre-existing Street Fighter Alpha and Darkstalkers tracks, and they sound appropriately cutesy and lively. Your mileage may vary as to whether they're worth a damn, but I think they're somewhat charming, and the GBA version does a fine enough rendition of these tracks. You've got some familiar sound effects and voice bites from the appropriate games that sound fairly crisp, not much else to say there, it sounds fine. Overall, Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo on Game Boy Advance is a perfectly fine competitive puzzle game if you're into that sort of thing, and if you're not, it might be a slightly harder sell due to its clunky feel and somewhat aggressive AI even on the easier settings, but it's a pretty fun puzzler with some nice animated bits thrown in for good measure. You've got a decent enough rendition of Super Puzzle Fighter on the GBA that's worth checking out if you can find a copy cheap enough, but there's also the PS1 port which is pretty decent. There's an HD remix version for the PS3, Xbox 360 digital storefronts if those are still active, and I think the arcade version is in one of the recent Capcom compilations if you want to give the game a go without scouring for a Game Boy Advance version, which remains a solid port and a fine addition to the handheld's puzzle output.